Welcome everybody to this session on developmentally appropriate practice, and joining us today is Fiona Semple from NHS Highland. She is the Child Health Manager for the Health Visitor and Community Children's Nursing teams. And we have Ruth Reid, who is the Early Years Workstream Lead for the Northern Alliance. And my name is Janey Irving, and I am STEM Education Officer with Education Scotland, and I'm taking the role really today of asking questions around this theme. So I will hand over, first of all, to Fiona to tell us a little bit about herself and what she does.
Hello everyone, thanks for letting me join your session. My background is very much midwifery and health visiting, and I'm now currently managing the teams as described. We're responsible for delivering the health visiting pathway. It's a home visiting service for the 0 to 5 years. The Scottish Government introduced this in 2016, and it's got a concentration of visits in the first year of life and specified developmental assessments as part of that and into the first 3 to 4 years of life. So this has been a radical reform for health visiting, has helped us build the relationships with families, with parents, and actually allowed us back into the family homes to really influence how the parents interact with the children, promote activities and early intervention if we notice anything unusual. We encourage parents to stimulate the children's activity and we guide them on that. So that first year of life, they have a minimum set of 8 visits, but this can be increased as and when children need. And it's really powerful because the health visitor is very able to observe how the child is interacting with the mum, so the nurturing environment. In the absence of that, there's things we can do to promote that. We also are observing whether the mother is reading the infant's cues. So, for example, if the infant's got the reciprocal interaction with the mum to smile as the first response back to a mum smiling. And these can be pressures when there's mental health issues and the mum really struggles because of her medication to have that smiling and that reciprocal relationship. So we sometimes have to put a lot of additional intervention in. We also guide them about the nutrition and the general health of the child. We really increase the activities of floor play, so the gross motor and fine motor skill, about promoting a child's curiosity and how to play with their toys and interact with their environment and their carers. And there's a lot of sensory stimulation as part of that. As I say, we recognise that the first 2 years of life are the greatest for an infant and small child's cognitive development. So it's really, really helpful if we can have that relationship with the parents. We then move on to developmental assessments at 13 to 15 months, which use the ratified tool, which is called the Area Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire. And it breaks it down into various domains of development. So you've got your communication, you've got your gross motor, fine motor, problem-solving skills, and you've also got the social emotional interactions, behaviours. So that's really powerful. And it's all done through play and activity. And we measure it in a scale that goes from white, grey or black. If the child is scoring within the black zone, that's an early indicator of something being developmentally running behind what that child should be at that age and stage. So we want to put a targeted intervention in. If it's in the grey, it might just need a wee bit more support from people in our teams, like our nursery nurseries, or even the speech and language, just dipping in and out for advice, or physiotherapy. And so forth. But it also is a good indicator to health visitors as to when they should be referring to other professionals like paediatricians or speech and language therapists, occupational therapists, physio, a huge range actually of allied health professionals. That's a kind of overview. Oh, sorry, I should have added, we also, in Argyll and Bute in particular, are deeply entrenched in the GIRFEC national framework. So the Getting It Right for Every Child is really powerful. We like to use it. It considers the whole world of the child. So it's not just about the child's development, it's actually about, as I mentioned, the carer interactions, who looks after the child, and the wider world of the child. So that's the home, the financial picture, the community settings, the additional supports that are there. So it's about the child at the centre of everything we do, and maybe helps us identify actually when families need a bit more help as well. So that's really powerful and how that influences a child's development.
Wow, thank you so much, Fiona. That's one of the reasons that we were really keen to come together today and to discuss this in terms of thinking about our newly qualified teachers and their first interactions with children and young people, whether that's in early primary or upper primary or even in secondary, is really getting that understanding of everything that has happened in the child's life and kind of where they've come from and where they might be. But also, as you mentioned there, the aspects of those developmental checks is really around some things that even concern us when we get into upper primary and early secondary. So it's really interesting to hear the kind of work that you're doing with the children in the first few months to years of life. Ruth, I just wondered if you had a particular question that you wanted to come in with or comment there.
No, I just wanted to say that really dovetails with everything that we do in early years, and of course we work really closely with health as part of GARFEC, but just thinking about starting with the child and really defining curriculum in that way as, you know, the child at the centre and the child's wider world. That holistic approach to curriculum is really reflected so strongly in realising the ambitions. So it's great just to kind of reinforce that and talk about developmentally appropriate practice today. Really looking forward to it.
Thank you, Ruth. So what we did actually before this was I sat and had a look at realising the ambition. Now, my background is as a secondary teacher, so I find this really interesting to think about where the children have come from and all the different developmental stages and how we can actually start to meet children where they are, rather than having assumptions and expectations in terms of when the children are in front of us. So what we did was we had a look, and I actually thought of some things that practitioners have asked me in the past to see, you know, questions that they have about children in maybe in primary 1 or primary 2, or just sort of general questions that I've been asked in my role as an education officer. So what we're going to do is we're going to break it down into some rough sections that we're going to think about. The first one are some questions around areas of well-being, such as social, emotional and communication development. And then we'll have a little think about some aspects of movement and coordination development. And the last area we'll think about is about promoting confidence, creativity and curiosity, which as a STEM education officer just makes me immediately smile, because one of the reasons I love working with younger children is the fact that they have that huge sense of curiosity about the world around them, and it's about how do we maintain that as we go through into the latter stages of secondary school. So starting off a little bit, one of the questions I have been asked is about children perhaps being overwhelmed by their emotions or unable to express them. And what might we observe if a child is in that state? What can we perhaps do to support the child? And I think it'd be interesting to consider this in terms of a much younger child and maybe then in terms of a primary 1 or 2 child. So I will hand over to Fiona first of all, and then Ruth, feel free to chip in as well.
Well, what we try and impress on parents, right, even from infancy, children express their emotions through their behaviours. So in the baby, you see the crying behaviours, but you also, parents quickly recognise the different kind of cries. As the child progresses into the toddler, we see their independence developing, but their part of that is their emotional regulation. And actually, the child that has missed out on valuable nurturing really struggles with that. So we see a lot of really temper tantrums. They get very angry outbursts. They can be frustrated if there are communication problems. They can get very distressed if people around them don't understand what they're trying to convey. So I think that's really important to understand, and I'm quite sure that the child that's missed out on that in early years, you're bound to be seeing that reflected in the classroom behaviours.
Yeah, and I'd just like to kind of chip in. I was thinking about really thinking about Ken Robinson, schools should be ready for children and not children ready for school. And I would say that it really does, when we're thinking about children in early levels, so going into primary 1 and even, in primary 2, I'm thinking about, child development rather than stage, because there's not one size fits all. Children they are not all, they don't just come out of a mould. Children are individuals and develop at individual rates. But we would definitely see the behaviours that you're talking about, Fiona, children communicating through their actions, emotions and words. We might see tantrums, that's tantrum-like behaviour. Before that, we might see conflict in primary 1 or 2, and in early years, we might see conflict or behaviours such as hitting, biting, fighting, inability to regulate and self-regulate. So you need to really just start by looking at that child that's in front of you and make them feel safe, secure and nurtured. I think that's so important.
I would absolutely agree, Ruth, and we see that very much even in the toddler stage, particularly if the home circumstances, but we need the whole story of what's going on in that family and with that child, because the child may sense tensions and get very angry, and as you say, it lashes out at other people and doesn't learn that that's not appropriate behaviour, so they're lashing out, biting, kicking, hissing, spitting. It's almost like an animal instinct. So I think it's really important that we understand the whole world of this child.
And I would also say that just that, the whole transition from ELC into school, and being aware of those behaviours as a reaction to stressors, and thinking about, when children come into our early years settings, even just the excitement of being in that setting can raise the cortisol within that child's body, and that excitement of being around people, and especially in the current situation where children might not have had so many social experiences, that can be reflected in some behaviours that we need to really understand, and we need to, as practitioners, help children to regulate their behaviour and not to be just kind of leaping to judgments, really.
I would absolutely agree, and I think for a health visitor, it's working with the parents sometimes to help the parents understand why their child reacts in that way. And there's lots of things we can do. It's about helping the child understand. So we encourage mum to use like wee emojis, smiley emojis, or sad or crying, so that they actually can talk to a child why, instead of just judging them as being a bad child, which the child isn't, helping them understand that actually that behaviour is causing further distress. So facial expressions are quite powerful, pencil drawings, and then really talk about why that behaviour is making them feel sad.
Oh.
Thank you both. That was really interesting, and I kind of think a couple of my next questions are perhaps really following up on this. So it's looking at maybe some specific examples of behaviours of children in perhaps primary 1. So the first question I had was, I have a child in my P1 class who seems to want to join in with group play. They are watching with interest, but they always seem to revert to playing by themselves. What can I do to support them to join in without maybe being too obvious about it?
Well, I'm going to jump in here, Janey, because I'm sure that most people who are within education, certainly within primary education, have heard of stages of play. So parallel play, where children are playing alongside each other, and solitary play, and then group play. But we must be really careful not to see that as a kind of hierarchy, because some children just will not maybe want to join in with the group, and they may just be quiet. So I think that's the very first thing I'd like to say, is that, trying to engage children in a group play is not necessarily for everyone. And so if they're just that type of child that then that's their personality, there's no point in trying to be forcing them. But I do think that really it's something we need to be mindful of. Age appropriate kind of provision may not necessarily look like what it looked like before the pandemic. So we may need to give more cognizance of children's experiences, where they may have been more isolated, where they may need more time to settle in, where they may need a softer, more nurturing and cosier environment, and more support from adults to almost mediate and know just when to sensitively step in and step back. So your observational skills are key here, I would say, too.
I think the other thing I'd add to that, Ruth, really important to praise even the child that's almost watching on the sidelines for being a good audience. So make them feel part of it and slowly build their confidence to want to become included.
Mm-hmm. That narration can be good as well, you know, like that almost, that can always be a really powerful way to support children. It's just narrating what the children's, you know, what they're actually doing. So, you know, you're watching the other children playing, or, you know, just that kind of neutral tone and narration where you support the child to understand what they're doing, and just almost to give them that awareness, that self-awareness, can be very powerful in helping them.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. And as you were talking there, it actually took me back to a time I was working with a primary 5-6 class, and one of the young people just was not so keen to join in. It was a grouped task where I'd put the children into teams to complete something, and he wasn't so keen to be part of a team, wanted to start the task on his own. But actually, over a little bit of time, he ended up going round and supporting the rest of the teams with the task to help them to complete it. So he ended up, you know, actually joining every single group, but it just was taking him a little bit longer to feel secure and comfortable to actually join in. So now hearing what you're saying, I'm starting to understand a bigger picture of why that might have been. So that's really interesting. Thank you. Another question that has come up a few times is about children in the class not coping well with the class routine. For example, staying seated at certain times, and the teachers finding this very hard to deal with, and what do they do in that situation? I will pass over. Ruth, take a deep breath there, so I'll pass over to Ruth.
Oh, you shouldn't. But what I was just going to say was, first of all, think about your routines. Going back to Ken Robinson, think about your routines. Are your routines fitting the child? Are the children having to fit routines? There are lots of things around being seated and whether that's appropriate for children, whether it's something that children can manage, and whether it actually would be interfering with learning for some children. If children, I mean, Fiona, maybe pass back to you for a wee bit of discussion about, you know, children who would maybe like sensory feedback and may not be able to stay seated because they may want to fidget and move, and but it's just really thinking about what are your routines, you know, and thinking about what is your pedagogy? Is your pedagogy developmentally appropriate? Going back to that and looking at the age and stage of your children, the children in front of you. If you've got wee primary ones, asking them to stay sitting down and concentrating, asking them to sit down and concentrate is actually that's the whole learning. That's their learning. That would just consume their wee brains for the time that you've got with them. So then asking them to sit down and be quiet and then do something else is probably too much, like a wee bit of cognitive overload there. Fiona?
I think I would agree, especially if they're very excited or even anxious, you know, how that makes their body react, as we've described. They may have missed out on some of that nurturing in their earlier years. So I think activities have got to be short. They've got to be kind of structured, but they need to take breaks as well, pause to reflect. Maybe, I don't know, do you do classroom moves, get them to stand up and do something that takes the fidgets away, and then regroup again.
I think you would be maybe looking at a setup within your classroom. And I mean, if we go back to realising the ambition, but also further back than that to building the curriculum, we can think about how a primary one classroom should not look significantly different from an ELC setting, both to aid transition and also to be appropriate for those young children. I mean, there's a lovely set of posters. I am new. It's got a wee baby. I have just come into the world. You know, love me and treasure me. And then I am 5. I'm an explorer. I am active. I need to play, move, and sing. And so that there's a lovely set of posters that I would encourage people to seek out and have a look at, which really connect so closely. But it is just that what is appropriate for our wee ones. It's those short intensive bursts of adult input, yes, but not for longer than 10-20 minutes at the absolute max. And for the rest of the time, self-directed, child-led, self-chosen learning within an active up, playing, exploring, outside. These things are so important for wee children and all children.
Absolutely. And I think that links back to a little video that you shared with me the other day about Ruth, about children, young people, and why it's so important for them to have time to play and to have their recess and to be able to go outside and play. And linking into that, I've had a number of people saying, over the course of the pandemic in particular, there was quite a lot of emphasis on going outdoors and getting fresh air, and they want to take their class outdoors, but they're not feeling very confident because they're brand new into teaching. So how did you start? What sort of things might you do to just get started with that?
Well, if I could go back to thinking about how and what led us to start quite a long time ago now, really, but what led us to start taking children outdoors for most of the day in the ELC setting that I worked in. We had a kind of quite a large intake of wee boys who just seemed to be unable to settle and like to mark, make and run round, and practitioners started to see that as a problem and started to think, this is a problem, this is difficult, we can't cope with this behaviour, and the instinct is just to sort of control. But actually, for those children, and thinking about child development in general, if a child's doing something a lot, probably the best way to deal with it is just to give them more of that. So we took them outside, got the suits on, went outside from the very first, that was the families were super. They came in and helped us by putting the suits on, as they came in or before they came in, and we were just outside straight away. And so that mark making was no longer an issue because the mark making was in sticks, it was in mud, it was freedom, it was gross and fine motor skills. It was no longer an issue of control, rather it was an issue of children learning. But just if you're thinking about how to get outdoors to start with, and perhaps you're in a school, I would say the first thing to think about is extend the time outdoors you've got already. So if you've got time before or after playtime, if you can make that time, go outside with your class beforehand, before playtime or lunchtime, and then that transition's really smooth for everyone. Or after, stay out, you come out and join the class and keep them outside. And Learning Through Landscapes has got a fantastic set of resources, cards, activities, which I would recommend anyone to go and have a look at. It's a really good starting point if you don't have confidence, just thinking about loose parts. That's my first suggestion for people.
I just wanted to add to that, Ruth. I think the outdoor environment is such a natural environment for children to learn and interact and use problem-solving skills, and they've got that scope to do that, the sensory awareness, the stimulation that's going on. And as you say, you kind of manage it, but actually the children in some ways become teachers to each other, and I think that's really powerful.
And teachers to practitioners, and just like the most magical moments outdoors, actually. and children becoming kind of embedded in their landscapes and going for walks where we had names for everything. And, as you go on a familiar walk, it becomes a map of that kind of childhood experience. We had a tree which was, obviously that was Piglet's house. It had a big hole in it, and that kind of thing. Those experiences, that kind of rich storytelling, and the experience of being in the stream and in the burn and talking about the dinosaur island, things like that that are moments that you just don't ever want to miss with young children. So yeah, get outdoors, enjoy the magic. You're the resource. It's not about buying things and it's not about doing activities always either. It's just about that sheer pleasure of being outside in nature.
Absolutely, folks. And as a former biology teacher myself, I loved taking the young people outdoors. We would go and explore and investigate, and even pupils all the way up into 6th year, one of their favourite things was to actually have that opportunity to go outdoors and be curious about what organisms they could find in and around the school building, setting up areas where they could actually the sort of bug hotels or little trap areas where they could actually have a look and see what they could collect, and identifying things when they get a bit older as well they really enjoyed, and just sort of starting to recognise what was around them and the variety and the amazing biodiversity in the area. One of the little tips that I would perhaps give to an NQT, especially if you're going to a school in an area you're not so familiar with, is also going out yourself and actually getting to know the area a little bit better, even just around the school building. Get yourself out at lunchtime, with a colleague, go for a walk around the school, see where might be good places to take a class, what sort of things are there, what's not there, where you might want to not to go to if perhaps it's near a busy road or that sort of thing, some of the obvious aspects of it. But if you're taking a class slightly further away, as Ruth was describing, with a walk, go and have that walk yourself and see what you can see in that area and find out a little bit more about the area around your school. So it's actually quite a nice thing to do, especially if you're new to the area.
Yeah, I was just going to say, to add to that, Janey, there's a suite of resources from the Care Inspectorate, My World Outdoors, and other resources that are sitting there which have got reams and reams of practical ideas around risk assessment, around safety, and around setting up environments outdoors or use of environments outdoors, things like water safety. So do go and have a look at that. Involve children in your risk assessments, and also as an NQT, do check with your SLT that you have done everything you need to do and that you've got all those procedures there. But don't let that drive your experience, but do make sure you've got all that in hand.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ruth. And as this is going to be embedded within the SWAY, we'll include links to all those resources mentioned and a few other ones that I've got in my head as well. Okay, so we're going to move on and think a little bit about movement and coordination development. And really starting off, Fiona, earlier you were talking about, gross and fine motor skills, and I want to think a little bit about what can we do to help develop a child's gross and fine motor skills, whether that's in early years or in early primary as well.
Oh, this is such an exciting part of their development because everything's through play, as we've referenced. So there's so many wonderful resources, like simple resources like clay, Play-Doh, things like that. Plastic bottles are wonderful for children, putting things in them, trying to shake them about. So what's the difference with sand, and sand pours out the bottles, or do we put wee stones in, and what noises, and the child's using problem solving skills the whole time. We encourage them at home to thread pasta. So we say to mum, we don't need to buy, as Ruth has referenced, expensive toys, a lace and some pasta. And before you know it, they're making wee necklaces that they can paint. There's just so much they can do for their fine motor development there. Gross motor is always about jumping about, walking the line. Sometimes you can play games in the house, just like tiptoeing, Walking in a straight line, Dad could lay down his tie and you can make it all wavy like a snake, and they're walking across the snake, and you can use your imagination. There's just so much that can be done. Sewing tasks are also a really good one. A piece of card or canvas work, wonderful for the hand-eye coordination and also the sewing. Baking in the family home is so wonderful. Children absolutely love, and I think that's been the one plus from lockdown, that a lot of families have got into baking. Just that sensory stimulation of working with, I'm going to call it goo. You know, it's like goo, the flour and the butter and the sugar, adding eggs in, and before they know it, that sensory stimulation and the lovely cakes they're making. So they're learning so much there, as well as their fine motor skills, amongst others, of course. So I think that's a huge start. Making sandwiches, helping with the lunch. I'm sure that can be transferable into the classroom setting.
It's, yeah, and I'm just going to come in and thinking about, you know, fine and gross motor skills. These things are so important. You know, I'm probably going to go back and reference emerging literacy here, Janey, because that's part of my remit, and that you'll find all those materials in the Highland Literacy website, and we'll put that in for you. But I do think that if children are going to be able to use the fine motor skills that they need for handwriting, they actually need to develop those gross motor skills first. So you need that full arm rotation before you can do the circular movement that you need, and the pincer grip as well. You need to develop all these things before you're ready to start handwriting. So those are absolutely essential and crucial skills for any kind of future development and academic work that you're going to be doing with children, and they are the absolute foundations. And please do remember that, and don't be thinking that, you know, we could force children to be doing these things before they're ready. We must make sure that we observe children, and if we see that they're not ready to write or not ready to be using a pencil, that we actually look at that and perhaps think how we can sort of support that. So what can you do in the classroom to develop gross and fine motor skills? All these things, just as Fiona said, baking, you know, any opportunity for just Play-Doh, malleable materials, all the science stuff, Janey. So everything to do with, you know, your water tray, your sand, painting, free flow, using blocks. Sewing is a wonderful activity, and things like woodwork if you're brave, but don't try and do all of it at once. Start small with the Play-Doh, start small with making the Play-Doh with the children, using the opportunity to measure the ingredients, using the opportunity to mix, to have that whole experience of baking and that sensory experience, and then to actually have that Play-Doh there to use. That's very, very valuable. And other things that are quite interesting, like using pegs. So pegs and washing lines. Don't you always be the person that's putting the washing line with the number line out. You know, think about asking children to do that, and having materials, real materials like socks, and putting them up in pairs and arranging them by size rather than laminated kind of cards and things. So lots and lots of activities that you can do. And of course, gross motor skills, get outdoors, climbing, running, ball play, jumping, all that kind of thing. TIG, some of the traditional playground games that children won't know, just help them to learn those games too. You know, that's the input that we can give as adults that they won't have. So
I was going to add, Ruth, you know, we also promote like music, rhyme time, so clapping, almost like the musical statues idea that children have to jump or get onto a spot when the music stops. They have to stand on one leg. All of these really help their balance and coordination as well. So really, really good activities that families can do and have fun in the family home that will help that gross motor skill development. Throwing balls, catching balls, bean bags.
And dancing.
Dancing
And putting on music. I mean, at the end of the day, or if it's a wet day, there is nothing better than getting that music on in the classroom and dancing, and that will absolutely help everyone to regulate as well.
Sounds fantastic. Friday afternoon disco for everybody. So I'm just thinking a little bit there as well about some examples again from some of the upper primary children that I worked with and early secondary. One of the things that we did was actually a bit of sort of paper folding and things, so making different kinds of complexities of paper aeroplane as a STEM activity, and that iterative design process where we kept trying to make more and more complex ones and involved quite a lot of paper folding. And then when you get into secondary, there's certain tasks and things that you might want children to do in subjects like science, where again, it's good to have some practice and to try this out. So for example, pipetting liquids is actually quite it's a fine motor skill, and it's a very precise motor skill as well. The other sorts of things might be putting things onto a microscope slide, for example. So some of the onion cell slides and things that some of my colleagues would have done, again, involves quite delicate fine motor skills. And it does involve a bit of practice, and we've experienced that, but actually, again, it's that meeting the children where they are and looking to see where they are in terms of their progress with that, and giving them the opportunity to practice rather than just having the expectation that they're going to be able to crack this straight away and go on with that. So Fiona, you kind of mentioned some of the PE games and things like that as well. Again, you know, when we're thinking about coordination and balance, you've described a few different games and things like that. Is there anything else that you would suggest for people to do to support children in terms of playing games to support the coordination and balance?
I think the list's endless here. There's so much you can do. You can put simple obstacle courses which use a whole range of the skills. What I'd encourage teachers to think about for coordination is think about the big muscles groups in the body. So it's the arms, the legs. Ruth already referenced the full arm motion. So everything that uses that. So if you create an obstacle course, if they crawl down, under, through, jumping over, even simple things like boxes or wee steps, using 2 feet, using 1 foot, jumping with a rope, almost skipping actions, all of these will really stimulate these big muscle groups, and everything comes together to help that gross motor coordination. So we can start that very early, and we'd encourage parents to be doing things very early on in a child's ambulation, but certainly developing it further as they grow up and get them outdoors, and you can do so much more swimming activities as well.
Yeah, and I think as well, you know, talking about PE games, just going back to what Fiona's saying there, you can combine that with loose parts. You can ask children to set up obstacle courses for each other. That would be, you know, that would be a really powerful experience for them too. And there are so many formal and informal things you can do. There's Better Movers and Thinkers, which is a wonderful resource, especially, you know, thinking past early years really and going further up primary into upper primary and secondary. That's really, really powerful and really tricky as well, difficult for me and challenging, so it gets your mind going as well. Lots of other things, especially thinking of early years and primary 1, music and movement, combining drama and dance, any kind of dance. Another thing that's very useful is the use of kind of IT, things like Sphero and programmable toys, robots and B-bots. Those activities can also allow children to have that experience of gross motor kind of development, and perhaps might engage some children that might not otherwise take part. So always something to think about too.
Well, thank you very much, Ruth. Okay, so we're moving on to our final sections. We're thinking a little bit about promoting confidence, creativity and curiosity. So when we look at the Realising the Ambition Being Me National Practice Guidance for Early Years in Scotland, this section of the guidance starts looking at what a child needs from their learning environment. We start thinking in terms of interactions, experiences and spaces. So one of the questions that I've been asked, and I'm not going to go through all of the questions that I've actually got here, but I'm going to start off thinking about tinker tables and loose parts play, because this has been mentioned a few times already. So can you tell me why is this such a valuable experience, and what sort of things are we talking about when we're thinking about tinker tables and loose parts? And could you take this all the way through school? Is this something that you could have at any stage? So I'll hand over to Ruth, who looks like she's going to jump in straight away.
I always
with
look like that. I'm just thinking my brain's fizzing with this discussion. So what I'm thinking about is, you know, I suppose we just always used to call it junk modelling. And whether we use toilet roll tubes or not has been a huge bone of contention over the years. But that kind of experience with the very youngest children, using found objects to create things, loose parts, is just using what's there. You know, it's whether you're on the beach and you're building up with stones and seaweed, whether you're in the house making dens, whether you've got boxes, and we've certainly got lots of boxes from Amazon. It's the best present anybody could ever get, is an Amazon box, a big box. Or if you have any deliveries of furniture in school, get the boxes, don't let anybody take them away. The box can be absolutely anything. It can be anything from a house to a spaceship. You know, let the children play with those things. But loose parts develops that creativity, and it takes the child's mind from the concrete, the here and now, into the abstract. So through that imaginative role play, which is so important, and then into the symbolic, which is the very, very basis of learning to read, learning to use number in every sense, so computational, but also to use number in a wider mathematical sense. It's the basis of all learning. So loose parts are so important. They take what we see in nature or around us in our environment, concrete things that we can touch. They take us through that dramatic role play or imaginary worlds that we're involved in, into that symbolism, that kind of you know, this thing is not what it is, but it's something else, and that's what it is when we're writing or when we're doing numbers. So yeah, it's so important. So I can't state the importance of loose parts play enough, and you can take that right up to, you know, through primary school. You can be taking apart record players, you can be taking apart an old laptop, and then you'll be rebuilding it and putting a new motherboard in before you know what you're doing. So yeah, that's I'll be quiet now.
Okay, so Fiona, have you got anything you wanted to add into that in terms of loose parts for younger?
Just going to say, if they just think about the very young child and how they find something in the house, or they find mum or dad's big shoes or something, and what they do with it is incredible. So even at the smallest, the youngest age possible, there's a natural curiosity to find out about things and relate to them and use them. So I think even a small child playing, dressing up, whatever, putting a box over their heads and banging on it, they're just learning all about their environment and the associations.
Absolutely, that reminds me very much of some of my secondary colleagues in the drama department, and the kind of skills that they would use within that context, but also within other departments as well. I'm thinking, you know, things like, you know, in geography, examining their surroundings and seeing what things are made of, and looking at things like rocks and the properties of them and what they can be used for. It all stems from that similar kind of work. So we're going to move on to probably our last question for today, or last couple of questions. And you mentioned a little bit there about going towards from the concrete to the abstract. And I think back to when I was a child and we played a lot of pretend games, enacting roles or scenarios. Why is that sort of thing important for children and young people to do?
I'll maybe come in first there and just say I think it starts in very early childhood. It's almost that modelling for a young infant. They start to copy the parent or the older sibling and what they are doing. So there's a bit of role modelling, and then the imagination grows because they're seeing more. They're learning from stories. If they're dressing up as a fairy, what would a fairy do? If they're dressing up as a forester, what does the forester do? The Gruffalo, we do the Gruffalo play activity. So their imagination's growing with it. I think there's so much we can do. We can do it, Ruth alluded to, outdoors, pretending we're in a den. What does that look like? How do we live in a den? So there's so much going on from just that natural curiosity, and then it becomes more concrete as they grow and mature.
And I would just come in and say that, you know, just to add, I mean, I think I've said quite a lot about it already, but it's that developing sense of kind of flow, which will then take us into our later childhood and then take us into our adolescence and into adulthood. So when we role play and try things on and imagine ourselves as different people, we're trying out all different kinds of possibilities. And when we find what gives us that absolute sense of flow, that's what will then lead us to be the geologist, Janey, you know, so that interest in rocks, or the interest in, you know, it becomes something that gives us that sense of personal identity. It gives us that intrinsic motivation that play develops. And so role play and these kind of scenarios are so important for young children to try on all the different possibilities that are out there, the endless possibilities, and to find that sense of flow and that sense of intrinsic motivation that really is learning, and it's so important for our fulfillment as adults in society. So
Wow. Okay. So I think we'll be rounding up there. And I think the last thing we're thinking about was about spaces and how the surroundings can help to promote creativity. And I just wondered, in terms of things that you have seen throughout your career, is there any one example of something, because I'm sure there's many, but is there any one example of a space or surroundings, whether it was in a school, an early years centre, somewhere outdoors, or somewhere in more informal settings, that would really spark and promote creativity with young people?
I think, well, I was thinking that probably it doesn't have to be anything, you know, it doesn't have to be something that's bought. That's the very, very first thing I'd like to see. You can't, you know, yes, it will involve resources, but it doesn't have to be something that you can buy in. I think there's two things. One of them is an availability of a broad selection of resources, but also that it should not have overwhelming sort of sensory, you know, overload. So although it's important to have lots and lots of things there, an enabling environment that children can access, something too busy can just overwhelm children. So a really good example of that is Reggio Emilia, and I would direct people to go and actually look at videos of the original Reggio Emilia Ateliers, which are in Italy, and these are big rooms within their ELC settings there, which are resources. And so they have a paper atelier, which is all different types of paper, all laid out very carefully, but not, you know, not inaccessible, accessible for children. They have a stone atelier. They have, so these areas are a place that they can go, find what they need, and then explore it. So I would direct people to go and look at that. That's inspirational.
Thank you, Ruth. Fiona, have you got any thoughts on this?
I just think the great outdoors is a wonderful space, and I think it's been highlighted many times over, but Ruth's testimony with her Forest School project, I think it was fabulous, and I think as health visitors we got ideas from the work that Ruth did in her early years setting, so wonderful.
Thanks, Fiona. I think that was mainly the practitioners there that did that.
Wonderful.
Well, it just remains for me to say thank you very much to both Fiona and Ruth for joining me today and for having this conversation. And I hope that this has been helpful to you as part of this resource on developmentally appropriate practice. As I say, all of the things we've mentioned in this video, I'll endeavour to get as links into the SWAY as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Janey.
Thank you.